to be recording. Hopefully it is. Yeah, for labs, once I grade them, it'll be a little comment box on the lab where you grade.
The private comment.
Hmm.
Where it says private comment.
Yeah, maybe. It could be anywhere. You'll see. It'll be obvious where it is.
Okay. Because unless I unsubmitted it, I couldn't go back into it.
Yeah.
I think I sent you a message and I was like, just ignore that.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah, that's why you never technically want to hit the submit button for independent work or labs. You don't need to hit the submit button because then you don't have access to it anymore. So just as long as it's shared with me, that's all you need to do.
oh, okay,
Keep it nice and simple.
okay.
And usually I would have had them all graded by now, but yesterday I had a sick daughter, so I didn't get any work done. Hopefully today I can do it.
Or,
Yeah,
did you see my email? Or,
not if it was from yesterday.
I think,
For
for the extra credits and crimes.
Oh, yes, yeah. I'll get back to you on that too. That sounds familiar, but I saw a lot of emails like that.
Did you go to State Stride?
Yeah,
Are you, what are you?
a freshman.
Did you have to walk?
Yeah.
I'm feeling so bad for you all. You got free t-shirt, okay?
What was so bad about it? Just because it was hot?
No, they gotta walk, freshmen gotta walk for everybody, like, for me, I'd be like, oh. Lord. But
I had to do that as a student too.
we didn't do that at Marshall.
All right, we've got less than 2 minutes to officially get started. What? Brevin, right?
Yes, sir. And we could do this online if we want.
I'll explain that again here in a minute. So far, I think I've called everybody's. Yeah. Morning. So Mark? Yeah. All right, it's 8. We'll get started. Do attendance. I know everybody's accounted for. But for the sake of the recording, my record keeping, I'll go through it all again. Black is here. Billie Jean Davies is here. Lizelle is not here. Sims is not here. Valdez is not here. Payton is not here. Fisher is not here. Vega is not here. Strickland is here. Whitaker is not here. Staley is not here. Faulkner is here. Cunningham is here. Newton is not here. Mark is here. Carr, right? Is here. Davies, Zoe is here. Smith is not here. Dunlap is. Hart is not. And Brevin is here. Anybody? Brevin, anybody? All right. So to remind you guys, for attendance, obviously we just took it. You need to be here on time to get the full points. As someone just asked, yes, you can watch the video online as opposed to coming in. Speaking of which, if you're watching this live right now, the first attendance keyword is going to be garbage can.
So after the video is over, excuse me, not the video, after the lecture is over, send me an email and include the keywords. And again, the first keyword is garbage can. Also, speaking of the videos, if you choose to do that instead of coming in person, obviously I haven't even posted a video yet from Wednesday because I had a sick daughter yesterday, so I didn't get any work done. I was dealing with her. So like I said at the beginning, that's the risk you run. So sometimes I don't get the videos out in time because I'm not guaranteeing that's going to happen because this is an in-person course. So I do my best to give you those other options, but sometimes it just doesn't work out. Good? All right, but speaking of that video, hopefully I will have it out today. Since this is the first week, you know, if you were absent on Wednesday, you still need to watch that video. And I'll give you until like the end of the weekend to do it. Extra time to do it since I'm just not putting it out. And for those of you who were here on Wednesday, you can still watch the video and answer those questions. But for you, since you already have attendance points, those points will be extra credit going towards your independent work. So any questions about that? All right, just a reminder, every Friday is gonna be Red Friday. So anybody wearing red will get a little extra credit. You already got that for your attendance. And if we take a picture, again, if we have time, a little bit more extra credit for that. Any questions about that? All right, labs. As a reminder, for the who here was not here at on Wednesday, I think you guys were all here, right? So this must be for the video or the people watching from home. Last week or this week's lab, usually if you've already have it done, I would have had it graded by now, but again, I had a sick daughter, so I apologize for that. The due date is normally Friday after lab, right? So today would be the due date at midnight. But as a reminder, next week we're doing the same lab. So for those of you who had lab on Wednesday and were there, you don't have anything to do next week. Therefore, your due date is going to be next Friday. So you've got really a whole week. It's the first week. I like that, right? It really gives us time to get used to the situation, get used to what's going on. So for those of you, again, online or watching the video, if you were not in lab this week, then you show up to lab next week and you'll just do the lab that you missed. Any questions about lab? No? Okay. And finally, because of this shift that we're doing, if you look at the tentative schedule, it says the week of Labor Day that we're not having lab, but now we are. So that's just the shift we're making. So because we are redoing lab 1 next week, we are doing lab the week of Labor Day. Does that make sense? Okay. And of course, I'll remind you as we get closer to the time. So that's it. Let's get started. Pull up my PowerPoint. My end. There we go. All right, let me back up a second and remind you where we're at here. Now let's work. All right. So again, chapter 1 is basically an introduction to the entire chapter or the entire textbook. Hey, come on in. This is a good time to remind you. If you ever come in late, make sure you email me, and I'll remind you afterwards. Make sure you email me to tell me that you came in late. Otherwise, you'll just be marked as absent. So I'll try to remind you before you leave. And remember, if you come in late, leave early. It's only half credit for attendance points. You can make up for it with the video, but anyway. So to remind you, chapter 1 is basically a preview of the entire semester. It's basically talking about what biology is. And so far, we've established the fact that biology is the scientific study of life. And we talked about kind of what science is, and that's where we left off. We talked about what is science, how is science different than other ways of understanding life. And then we left off with this. We're talking about the differences and the relationships between these 3 words: hypotheses, theories, and facts. We talked a lot about it this last slide. We were on this one for a while. But as far as the exam is concerned, the most important thing for this slide is what's here in bold. The theory is broader in scope than a hypothesis, right? So when people say it's just theory, it's a really incorrect way of saying things, because the theory is actually substantiated and it's very broad. So let's talk about how theories and hypotheses are related. This is an example I came up with. It's not in the book, but here's 2 different hypotheses, right? One hypothesis, you don't need to write any of this down, but one hypothesis is long, thin roots are an adaptation that helps some plants survive in an urban habitat. So you can see right here, there's a tree growing between the cement and a brick wall, right? A rock and a hard place, so to speak. So it's probably, a hypothesis is it has long, thin roots. And then adapted those, so the species adapted those so it can survive in that kind of environment. So that's one hypothesis. Another hypothesis that seems completely unrelated is the unusual bone structure in the hummingbird's wings is an evolutionary adaptation that provides an advantage in gathering nectar from flowers, right? So here we have two seemingly unrelated hypotheses. But these things can be tied together using this theory, right? The following theory ties together these two seemingly unrelated hypotheses. Adaptation to the local environment evolved by natural selection. What I'm trying to say here, and again, there's nothing to write down on this slide, this is just an example. The theory of natural selection, which is very broad, because you have that one very broad theory, you can have a lot of hypotheses that come off of it, basically. And those are just two examples. So any questions about the relationship between a hypothesis and a fact? Hypothesis and a theory. Pretty simple stuff. Let's talk about what a fact is. You need to know this for the exam. A fact is a piece of information that is considered objectively true based on all current evidence. And I go back to the example I used on Wednesday. When we talked about Mexosones, right? So somebody could say, Mexosones has the best margaritas in town. That's not a fact, because it is not considered objectively true. That's subjective, right? That's an opinion. But if I were to tell you that Mexosones is 3.2 miles away from here, assuming that's true, then that would be a fact, or it could be a fact, right? Because that is something that's considered objectively true, based on all current evidence. Facts can be verified, therefore they are distinct from opinions. Like I said, I can verify that that place is 3.2 miles away, or however far away it is. I can't verify which place has the best margarita. Wouldn't mind trying, but I can't verify it. A lot of people associate facts with science, which is good. It's important, but accumulating facts is not the primary goal of science. The facts by themselves don't tell the whole picture. For example, my thesis work for my master's was looking at the genome of the watermelon plant. Actually, the transcriptome, but we won't get into that. So I looked at the expression of genes. Basically, I knew every gene that was in there and how much it was being expressed. And that alone, that's a bunch of facts, right? This gene was expressed that much, this gene was expressed that much, this gene wasn't expressed at all, so on and so forth. Thousands of genes, I can tell you exactly how much of those genes were being expressed at any given time. And by itself, all those facts are useless. However, I was using those facts to figure out which genes were responsible for making the trichome, which are like little fuzzy hairs on plants. So again, facts are useful, but that themselves is not the primary goal of science. I think your book actually uses the example of a phone book, if you guys remember what those are. Phone books are filled with facts, right? This person was at this address, this is their phone number. But that's just a book of facts, but that's not scientific, right? So again, facts are important, but they themselves are not science. So your book points out that the cornerstones of science are the explanations that apply to the greatest variety of phenomena. So now you guys know what a fact is. You probably already knew. Are there any questions about what a fact is? I probably wouldn't even ask you anything about it on the exam. Your book gives an example of three scientists that you probably have heard of: Newton, Darwin, and Einstein. I don't need to write that down. I'm not going to test you on this either, but just an example. These three people stand out in the history of science because their theories had very broad explanatory power, right? So outside of this classroom, probably nobody knows who I am, right? And you guys are just now getting to know me. Despite the fact that I've done science, right? I've done studies. I figured some things out, but what I figured out was very specific. It wasn't very broad, so I'm never going to be famous for the things that I figured out in science. Anyway, let's talk about controlled experiments. So, I think we've established you guys were all here in lab, so in a way, this is going to be a review. There are going to be some new words in there that we didn't talk about in lab that you do need to know. So, like we already talked about with the scientific process, right? You observe something, you come up with a question, and then from that question, you have a hypothesis, and then you come up with different predictions, ways to test that hypothesis. So again, that's what we're talking about, is testing hypotheses. When we do this, what we need to do is change one factor and keep the other factors constant. And I guess you could write that down if you want, but maybe not. I wouldn't waste it. more than likely, you're not gonna get tested on this as much as you're gonna go through this as we do labs every week. But think about the pre-lab you already did. When we're talking about changing one factor, keeping all the other ones held constant. So again, someone answered for the pre-lab. I think the question was, all right, you give a set of plants, what are some questions or what's a question you could ask, right? What kind of experiment can you do? And one of the people said that, what was the hypothesis? Plants grow better with soda as opposed to water. And then the next question said, all right, well, one of the questions said, what are some things that you need to consider? What are some of the factors? Because in that experiment, you would want everything to stay the same. The only thing that you want to change is the fact that one plant's getting water and the other one's getting soda. Because if one's getting more sunlight than the other, that's a fact. That might be what's causing the other one to grow more than the other. Or if they have different types of soil, or maybe even the temperature of the liquid you're giving it, right? So if you're giving one soda and one water, you want to make sure it's the same temperature, because that might have a factor. So you want to change only the one factor that you're trying to test. And those factors are called variables. And you need to know that. When we're talking about the things you change, or the things you try not to change, those are called variables. Things that change in an experiment. Book definition of a controlled experiment, which is the next bullet point here, is one that compares two or more groups that differ only in one variable that the experiment is designed to test. So in the example I just gave, that controlled experiment consists of two groups, right? One group, i.e. one plant, that was getting nothing but water, and one group, i.e. one other plant that was getting nothing but soda. And that brings us to what we call the control group versus the experimental group. The control group lacks or does not receive the specific factor being tested. So in this case, if we're saying soda is good for plants, the one getting the water would be the control group, right? That's the one that's not getting the experimental factor. And the other plant that is getting the soda, that would be the experimental group. And if you remember the example I gave when I was talking about, is urine good for grass? And I talked about an experiment where you have one set of plants that gets pure water, one set of plant that gets 25% urine, one set of plant that gets 50% urine, so on and so forth. So again, the one that's just getting water, that would be the control group. Every other group of plants that's getting the different variations, different concentrations of urine, that would be the experimental group. Any questions about this slide? You guys are all probably already familiar with these words. All right. Sure we're good? No questions? Still see a little bit of note taking. It's a good time to remind you that you all have access to these PowerPoints. So not only, obviously, am I giving you the videos, assuming they record, the PowerPoints themselves can be found on Google Classroom. So if I ever go too fast for you and you don't feel comfortable telling me to slow down, which I wish you would, it's okay to tell me to do that. Have access to it. All right, moving forward, we're still talking about controlled experiments, basically giving you a vocabulary lesson here. The next one is the independent variable. We've talked about this in lab too. That is the variable whose change is not affected by any other variable in the experiment. And I'll come back to that. I'm teaching out of the book. Your book talks about independent before dependent. So I did too, but let's talk about the dependent and we'll go back to the independent. The dependent variable is the thing being studied and measured in the experiment, and the thing that changes is a result of changes to the independent variable. So the independent variable is dependent, the dependent variable is dependent on the independent variable. So in this case, when we said, let's see, plants, we're talking about giving the plants soda to see if it's good for them. In that case, we're going to measure, how are we going to see if the plants do good? I keep saying, is it good for plants? What does that mean? That means a few things. If we were to do that experiment, can you name one way that we could measure if the plant is doing good?
It lives.
If it lives, that's a good way. Yeah. Does it live or not? That's good. How about another way? And that would work. What's another way we could measure to see how good the plant is doing?
Grows.
Yeah, does it grow, right? And how can we measure growth?
Height.
Height would be one way. Maybe count the number of leaves. Maybe even weigh it. I don't know. But yeah, we can measure that. So in that case, the growth, maybe the height, let's just keep it that simple. The height of the plant would be the dependent variable. and it would be dependent on how much soda it was getting, right? So that the soda would be the independent variable. Is it getting 50% water or 50% soda? Is it getting 25% water and 75% soda, so on and so forth? So the dependent variable is the thing that is, obviously it's in the word, that is dependent on the independent variable. It is the thing that changes. Or, and I don't think this is in your book, I kind of paraphrased it right here with this third bullet point. The independent variable is the cause or the thing that you change, and the dependent variable is the effect. So we change the concentration of soda in that experiment. That is the cause, and the effect would be how does the plant respond to that? And your book does point out again in this bottom PowerPoint, or excuse me, bottom bullet point, a well-designed experiment often tests just one independent variable at a time. The second keyword for attendance, if you're online, is going to be paperclip. So when you email me after the class to say, hey, I was there online, then you give the first keyword, and then the second keyword. And again, the second one is paperclip. Anyway, this also brings me back to a question somebody asked last time we met. She was asking about independent work. And can you do an experiment for independent work? And yes, you can. That would be a great way to get some independent work. And also, like I said then, you don't even need to do an experiment. Sometimes, especially since you guys aren't scientists, just the mental process of designing an experiment will get you points. So if you just have this idea of some experiment that you wish you could do, and you can't do it, that's fine. We can go through all this. We can figure out what the dependent variable is and the independent variable and the factors. We can design an experiment and just not do the experiment, and you'll still get points for it. Because again, it's a good mental exercise to design an experiment. Anyway, any questions about all these terms? You guys are easy. All right, do that or you're just waking up still like me. Controlled experiments, still, we're talking about those. Here's a new word coming up. I bet some of you might know what it is. Does anybody know what a placebo is? What's a placebo?
It's something that has like if you were testing two groups, one group would get the actual medication, the other would get the placebo, which is nothing.
Exactly. That is exactly what a placebo is. And they did that with some of the, COVID-19 vaccines, right, in the medical trials. Some people would get it, some people just get a saline shot, didn't get it. That is what placebo is. It's a medical drug trial medical drug trials can include a placebo, which is a medically ineffective treatment. It allows the placebo group to serve as the control group, and typically the placebo group does not know they're receiving placebo. So in that situation I was talking about, for the COVID-19 vaccine, they didn't know what they were getting, nobody knew. All they knew was they were getting a shot, and maybe it was going to be the vaccine, maybe it was going to be the placebo. They did not know. Because the mind's a powerful thing too. Sometimes just thinking that you're getting it might help. I don't know about what COVID-19, I don't know enough about that yet, but sometimes your mind can protect you. If you think you had some medication, then your mind might be like, all right, well, I'm okay. But not only do often the people getting the treatment not know where they got the treatment and the placebo, but also sometimes the people giving the medication or the treatment don't know either. And that's what we call a double-blind experiment. So any questions on what a placebo is or what a double-blind experiment is? I probably won't ask you anything about this on the exam. This is good stuff to know, especially if you're writing independent work and you happen to write something about any kind of medical treatment or medical trial. Now you know what these words mean when you come across them. Oh yeah, it's a good time to remind you. That was not on the board. Remember, technically independent work, the 100 points is not due until December 4th, but also technically you should be getting 7.6 points a week. So, by the end of Sunday, by the end of Sunday, technically you should have 7.6. So you guys should start working on some papers. Think of some questions. All right, so again, no questions about this? All right, let's move forward. Every chapter in this book has something called the process of science that relates a little bit to that chapter itself. And because I'm never going to test you on it, I'm always going to skip it. So it's there in the PowerPoint if you want to read up on it. And obviously it's in your book if you want to read it. but I'm not going to go through it to save time. And again, never going to test you on that stuff. But you should read it. It is a good mental exercise. Because again, obviously you're not designing an experiment, but you are reading about an experiment. That brings us to the last minor bullet point of this first major bullet point, which is evaluating scientific claims. As far as the exam is concerned, this is not a very important bullet point, but as far as real life is concerned, this is probably one of the more important bullet points of this semester. Because none of you guys are scientists, none of you plan to be scientists, so everything you're going to learn here is not going to apply to your professional life, but this is something that everybody should know how to do, evaluating scientific claims. It's going to happen a lot, right? The government's going to say, hey, you should get this vaccine, and then you should be able to evaluate the claims on, should I trust the government? Should I not trust the government? Let me evaluate these scientific claims. Or maybe your friend from high school is trying to sell you essential oils. She's making some scientific claims, like it'll cure your cancer, whatever it may be. Well, you need to be able to evaluate these scientific claims. There we go. Who knows what pseudoscience is? It's everywhere these days. Just get on Facebook, at least on my newsfeed, there's pseudoscience everywhere. Pseudoscience is a field of study falsely presented as having a scientific basis. So basically, it's fake science, but it seems real. And I think I mentioned this on Wednesday too. It's a dangerous thing, especially when people know what they're talking about. Because I could tell you, I know enough to tell you a bunch of true statements that all lead to a big lie. So I can tell you this lie, but then support it with true statements. Does that make sense? Pseudoscience is really good at that. So they're drawing false conclusions by giving you true statements. Anyway, let's talk a little bit more about it. How do you recognize pseudoscience? Well, the first one, this is not in any particular order, but the first one we're going to talk about is anecdotal evidence. That's a huge one. Anecdotal evidence is evidence that's based on a single or a few examples and don't support generalized conclusions. Basically, it's a story. But it's so powerful. Again, using vaccines as an example. If I were to choose any vaccine, I should say, if I were to choose a particular vaccine and give you the evidence and give you the numbers and like say, all right, this is how many millions of people have had this vaccine. These are the 5 people who had something bad happen to them. These are the thousands of people who didn't get the vaccine and died, right? So I could give you those numbers, but if you know somebody who had the vaccine and got sick from it or died from it or something, that's anecdotal evidence, but it's so powerful, right? Because that's somebody you know. Doesn't matter how many numbers I'm throwing at you. You know, if you know somebody who got hurt from the vaccine, that's really going to hit home for you. So that's why anecdotal evidence, even though it's scientifically useless, it's still very powerful. So you have to be very careful with anecdotal evidence. The other thing you should look at is what is the source of information? For example, is it peer reviewed? Especially these days, man, you can look up anything. Just think of anything crazy, and I bet you get supported on the internet. You can probably find some article somewhere that says whatever crazy thing you're thinking is true. Matter of fact, if you want to do that for independent work, just make sure you tell me that's what you're doing. You say, I was wondering if I could prove that Bigfoot has had sex with Loch Ness Monster. And I just wanted to see how crazy, what kind of crazy evidence I could find. As long as you tell me that's what you're doing, you're not trying to actually convince me that Bigfoot had sex with Loch Ness Monster. You can do that as independent work. But yeah, definitely, you're not going to find any peer-reviewed articles about the mating habits of Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster. Another thing you should think about, this one's probably going to be more relevant to you guys. Is it from a company trying to sell you something? So again, we're looking at the source of information. I read something. I remember when the Impossible Burger came out, Impossible Whopper, I think it's called. I was pretty excited because, I do like Burger King. Red meat is bad for you, especially at Burger King. So I was like, cool, a plant-based burger. That would be good. That'd be healthy for me. So I was reading up on it, and I read one study that was saying something like it was basically giving guys man boobs. It didn't say it like that. It sounded more scientific. But they were saying that there was estrogen in it. There's higher levels of estrogen because they were using soy. I don't remember the whole reasoning. Anyway, my point is, so I'm really digging into this article I read, and then it said, I'm like, all right, looking at the source, and I read who it was. The author of this study was Dr. So-and-so, so I looked that person up. Turns out that Dr. So-and-so was a veterinarian who was the president of some kind of a professional organization, basically a cow lobbyist, right? So some company, some lobbyist company where they represent cows and like try to get people to eat cows, eat more meat, right? So again, I followed the trail, figured out this guy as a veterinarian too for cattle, and somebody who's the president of that source or of that company, excuse me, that group. Obviously, they would be a little bit biased, right? They want you to eat more meat and less plants. So that's the kind of thing you need to look for. Obviously, that's just an example. I'm not going to test you on some paper that I barely remember. Anyway, any questions about what pseudoscience is or anecdotal evidence or this idea of being wary of the sources? All right, here's a little table from your book that kind of puts it all into perspective all together. Features of science versus features of pseudoscience. Science adheres to an established and well-recognized scientific method. Pseudoscience does not. Actually, I saw a great documentary about flat earthers. It was really interesting because they weren't completely off. Again, they had some true ideas, but they were using those true ideas to come up with false conclusions. And they weren't doing science. They were not employing the scientific method. One of them did do an experiment, again, trying to prove that the earth was flat. And then it was a great experiment. But then when they did it, turns out they convinced themselves, oh yeah, the world is not flat because they did such a good job on the experiment. They proved to themselves that sure enough, it is curved. And then another group of people in that same documentary just they rejected that experiment. So that's what they do. Anyway, if it's science, you have repeatable results. If it's pseudoscience, you have results that cannot be duplicated by others. Results that rely on a single person or are solely opinion. So somebody might say, oh, I did this experiment, but then yet nobody else was able to do the same experiment or get the same results every time they do the experiment. Pseudoscience. Science has testable claims that can be disproven, right? We said that at the very beginning. That's what a hypothesis is, right? It has to be testable. It has to be able to be disproven. And then features of pseudoscience. Unprovable or untestable claims. Reliance on assumptions or beliefs are not testable. Science is open to outside review. Pseudoscience is not. Science usually has multiple lines of evidence. Pseudoscience usually does not. So, any questions about this? Here's yet another thing that your book offers, and so am I. I'm not going to talk about all of them. But it's sort of like a little checklist. And you should keep this handy too, I think. When you're doing your independent work, you want to make sure your sources are reliable. And this is a little checklist you can use to see if they are reliable. And of course, nothing's perfect, right? No source is perfect. Some things go wrong with your journals, for example. Anyway, any questions about this? All right, good. We're done with the first major bullet point. Let's get into the properties of life. Because like we said, biology is the scientific study of life. So the first thing we determined was, what is science? We just finished that bullet point up. Now we're talking about what is life. So yes, what is life? What distinguishes living from non-living things? Like for example, am I alive? Yes, you guys just know it. You guys are alive too. Is this eraser alive? No, it's not. There's probably living things on it. It's probably not alive. And why? What makes me alive and this thing not alive? It's weird, right? We instinctively know generally when something is alive and when it's not. It does get a little bit complicated. Usually not in your everyday life since you're not a biologist, but yeah, generally speaking, we just know when something is alive and when it's not. So what are some of the things? Any guesses before I get it to you? And what I'm about to give to you, you do need to know. So if you're taking notes, get ready to take notes. If you are a note taker. So what are some of the things? What are some of the things I do and that you do that this thing doesn't do? Yes, sir. Mark.
Energy consumption.
Energy consumption. That's good, right? I need energy. I get it from food. Without that, I would die. This thing doesn't eat. However, and this is interesting, is this computer alive? No, a computer's not alive, right? It's not alive, but it does consume energy. So I'm glad you said that. And you guys do need to know that. Energy consumption is one of the properties of life. That's what I'm about to give you is the properties of life. And the interesting thing about these properties of life are that some non-living things do exhibit some properties of life. But they're only living if they exhibit all the properties of life. So yeah, energy consumption. Another way of putting that is energy transformation. So we eat food, and you're going to learn all about this in chapters 5, 6, and 7. We eat food and we digest it, right? We break down those molecules. And when we do that, we release energy. The energy that kept those molecules together is then released. And that energy is not even used directly by us. We then use that energy to make something called ATP. And then that energy is what we use in our cells. We'll get to that later. And also, the energy that's in those bonds of the food that we just ate, that energy ultimately came from the sun. Whether you're eating meat or plants or fungi, whatever, that energy ultimately came from the sun. And we'll talk about that in chapter 7, I think. So anyway, process of energy. Any other questions? Or excuse me, any other properties of life? What's some things that you do that make you alive that, I don't know, this bag does not do? Anything living versus non-living. Any other guesses? You guys probably know them. Hopefully you're just too shy to say. So here we go. Let's talk about it then. Order is the first one. I know it's a little bit harder to read. But again, your book is using the sea turtle as an example. Order is apparent in many of the turtle structures, such as the regular arrangement of the plates and the turtle shells. So, yeah, order. Things are ordered if they're living. Sometimes it's hard to see. Like if you look at a sponge, for example, that might not look living, and it might not even look ordered. But then if you were to get a microscope and look inside of its cells, then you can see the order. Like, okay, clearly there's a nucleus, there's some mitochondria, there's some lysosomes, all the different parts of the cell. You'd be able to see them. You could see that there is order in the cells. Especially if you could really look into it and look at the DNA. See that there's a clear order to those molecules. The next thing, cellular. Life is cellular. So if it's made of cells, it is life. That's an easy one. It's made of cells. The next one, growth and development. Right? Things that are alive, they grow and they develop. Sometimes that's a little bit harder to see. Like again, if you were looking at a single-celled organism, it might not appear to grow. Right? It might stay the same size, but it is developing. There's things going on at the cellular level that we may not be able to see with the naked eye, but it's happening. It's obvious with humans, right? You start off as a single cell, but you're born a little baby, right? And you grow and develop. Not only do you get bigger, but you change, right? You develop. Next thing, like we already said, energy processing. Every living thing needs energy. This is in no particular order either, by the way. For the exam, the good news is for you guys, it's a multiple choice exam. So it's not like the question's going to say, list all the properties of life. That would be a little bit difficult. But what it might do is list a bunch of stuff that are the properties of life, and one of them that's not, you need to choose that one. Or maybe vice versa. You might get a list of a lot of things that are not a property of life, and then one that is, and you need to choose the one that is. Or there might be a question where I say, all right, is this thing alive or not? And I'll describe it to you. And then based on that description, you'll need to tell me, is it alive or not? Anyway, the next thing after energy processing is regulation. So in this case, I want to talk about the sea turtle. It says, although they're surrounded by salt water, the sea turtles can carry out regulation of the salt level in their body by excreting excess salt through their eyes. Not that you need to know that. But yeah, it's in a salty environment, but on its insides, it can't be that salty. So it regulates itself. Any guesses to what temperature it is in here? Cold. I would guess, I don't know, maybe 70 degrees Celsius. I mean, that would be so hot. 70 degrees Fahrenheit. How many of you figure that you are 70 degrees Fahrenheit right now on the inside? Any guesses to what your temperature probably is in Fahrenheit right now? Come on, you guys know this.
96.
Yeah, bro, 98.6 probably, right? Give or take. That's because of regulation, right? Your body stays about 98.6 degrees, despite how cold it might be in here. I think it's going to cool it, whatever. Or despite the fact that when you go outside, it might be hot. Of course, it's probably not going to get over 98.6 today, but nonetheless, you regulate things. Any questions about regulation? All right, the next one is evolution. A whole chapter on that. Life evolves. Now, here's an important distinction that we're really going to talk about later. That individual organisms do not evolve. You do not evolve, I do not evolve. A single bacterium living on the surface of that, it does not evolve. Individual organisms do not evolve. But life itself changes over time. Populations change. That is evolution. Here's a big one. Well, sorry, are there any questions about evolution? All right. The next one, and this is a really big one, is reproduction. Life and reproduce. The reason I say that's a big one is because I think one of the greatest examples of something that's not living is a virus. Viruses are not living, but it's so close. They have order. They're not cellular, but it's close to being cellular. Everything else they have, like, well, I won't jump into it yet. We'll talk about it more later, but they cannot reproduce on their own. And that's why you get infected with a virus. That's basically just a virus trying to reproduce. It's hijacking your cellular machinery because it can't reproduce. So it uses your cells to reproduce. Anyway, any questions about reproduction? All right, the last one we mentioned here is response to the environment. So in this case, it says the sea turtle, the sex of the sea turtle hatchling varies in response to the environment. Warmer temperatures favor the development of females, while cooler temperatures favor the development of males. Matter of fact, I just read something recently this past week. I should have saved it, and you guys can find it, read about it, write about it for independent work. But there are more and more female sea turtles coming out of Florida now because climate is changing. Things are getting warmer, therefore we're getting less males and more females. It's a real thing. But anyway, that's just an example, just another idea for independent work. Speaking of which, the third word for attendance, if you are online, is going to be female. Anyway, any questions about the properties of life? We have time to jump into this. Actually, this should be really quick. The third and final major bullet point of this chapter is the major themes of biology. Now we really are getting into the preview of what the rest of the semester is going to be about. So let's just jump into it. The first thing we're going to talk about throughout the semester in every single chapter is going to be the relationship of structure to function. So whether we're talking about the cellular level or looking at a whole body, right, we're going to see this relationship between the structure of something and its function. So your book gives us examples. Can anybody tell what this is? It looks a little bit weird. You may have not seen it look like this, but you've probably seen them before. Yeah, those are lungs. Specifically, what we're looking at is the blood vessels in the lungs, right? So the rest of the stuff has been removed. We're looking at the blood vessels. And look, there's a lot of surface area on those blood vessels. Does anybody know what this is? Or these are? Red blood cells, right? And they also have a lot of surface area. So they have, in a sense, they have similar structures, right? They have a lot of surface area. Why? Because they have the same function, right? So they have similar structures because they have the same function. What is that function? Well, that function is to diffuse carbon dioxide out and then oxygen in, right? So they need a large surface area to be able to do that. So again, this relationship between structure and function. That's just an example. I'm not going to ask you anything about that on the exam. All right, information flow. This is something we're going to talk about throughout the semester too. At all levels of organization, meaning whether we're talking about the molecular level or the cellular level, or if we're looking at an organ, a whole organ system, or a whole organism, or if we're talking about a whole ecosystem. Whatever we're talking about, there is information flow. And the book example is this. The information about the amount of glucose in your bloodstream is received by organs such as the pancreas. And then once that happens, the pancreas then releases insulin and regulates the level of glucose in the blood. So again, that's just an example. I'm not going to ask you about the pancreas or glucose or any of that. It's just an example of how when you eat something, right, your body then starts giving information, right? It starts receiving and giving information, and then your body responds to it. Any questions about that? All right, the next one is pathways that transform energy and matter. So even though that is a property of life, it's also going to be one of the major themes of biology that we talk about almost every chapter. as you should know, and if you're taking notes, you'll need to write this down because you're really gonna learn about this in chapter 5, so this is just a preview, but life requires energy, as we already said, as Mark already said, we require energy. For the most part, almost every single ecosystem on Earth gets that energy ultimately from the sun. You get your energy ultimately from the sun, not directly, right? You can't just go out, lay around naked and get energy that way, right? You have to eat. But sunlight is captured by plants and other photosynthetic organisms, and then they convert that energy into something called chemical energy, right? And it's going to be in those bonds of the molecules that we're going to learn about in chapter 5. And then we call that stuff food, right? We eat those plants, or we eat the animals that ate those plants. Again, if you're taking notes, you need to write any of this down, because this really is a preview. When we get to this in chapter 5, then you'll need to know it. So for exam 2, you need to know all this, but for now, it's just an introduction. Some energy is converted to heat and lost from the ecosystem. So again, you guys are 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Because as you are breaking down those molecules, not all of that energy is put to use. A lot of it is lost as heat. Most of it is lost as heat. Anyway, finally, energy flows through ecosystems and exits as heat, while matter is recycled. Here's a picture of what I'm talking about. So the stuff on Earth, for the most part, stays on Earth, right? All the stuff on Earth pretty much is just recycled. We might break it down, it might be changed into different types of chemicals, different types of molecules, but overall, the stuff on Earth stays on Earth, right? Except energy. Energy comes in the form of sunlight, and it eventually leaves in the form of heat. So yes, Earth is putting off heat. And the way it got that heat ultimately was from the sun. Pretty simple stuff, right? All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is the interactions within biological systems. And again, when I say biological systems, what I mean is, are we looking at something at the molecular level? Are we looking at it at the cellular level? Are we looking at tissues like skin? Are we looking at whole organs? So your book points out that there are many interactions within and between biological systems. So again, if you were to look at your cells and look at the molecular level, there are molecules interacting with each other. But then there are also molecules that are interacting with organelles. And some of those organelles are obviously interacting with the cell as a whole. And those cells are interacting with other cells. And those cells are interacting with organs, right? So it's an interaction between all the systems. And obviously at each new level, the complexity is going to increase. So when you're looking at the cellular level, the molecular level, that's complicated in itself. You're looking at these chemical reactions, you're looking at these molecules. That's complicated, but then you just take it up a step, and you're looking at larger molecules. And now, not only are you still looking at that small original complexity, but now you're looking at how these things interact with each other, so on and so forth. The higher you get, the more complex it gets. You're not going to get tested on this. Here's a visual of everything I just said. I might ask you to know this on the exam, but probably not. You might need to know, or if we're talking about the systems of life, when we're talking about going very small to very large, or going very large to very small, you might need to know each step. The first and smallest will be molecules and atoms, right? Molecules and atoms make up organelles. Organelles are parts of cells. Cells get together to make up tissues. Tissues get together to make up organs and organ systems. And then those things get together to make an organism. A bunch of organisms together is called a population, if it's the same species. And then if you talk about all the other species around it, then it's called a community. So right now, if we were to talk about all the humans in this room, that's a population. But then if we consider all the bacteria that's living in and on us, and maybe just assume there's a mouse somewhere in this room, that would be a community, right? So we're talking about all the different species living together. And then, if you're talking about a community, and you're looking at all the different species and how they interact, but then also consider the fact that there's a light coming in from here, and cold air coming out from there, and all the other things that are not living but affect living things. That's what you call an ecosystem. And then finally, all the ecosystems together on Earth put together form what's called the biosphere. So I know I went through that pretty quickly, but again, probably I won't ask you about it for the exam. And if I do, it's all pretty much straightforward and it's right there. So any questions about this? Okay. The last bullet point we're very quickly going to talk about, there's a lot of questions about this on the study guide, but it won't be on the exam because there's a whole chapter later in the semester, for exam 3, I think, where we're gonna talk a lot about evolution. So for now, we're just gonna skim through it, not gonna be tested on it. Life is distinguished by its unity and diversity, meaning, when you look at, look at a human versus a dog, very different, right? There's definitely different things. We definitely have diversity. But there's also things that are very similar between a human and a dog, right? We're all mammals, we have vertebrae, we have 4 limbs. At one point in our development, we all had tails, so on and so forth. So all that bullet point is saying is, despite the fact that there's such a large diversity of life on Earth, there's also a large amount of unity. Sometimes that's hard to see. If you compare a human to a bacterium, for example, obviously it's very different. But if you compare things molecularly and cellularly, there are, again, some very similar things, but we'll talk about that later. So, the evidence that points to all this unity and diversity, really, are the similarities among and between fossils and living organisms that we're going to talk about later in the semester. Common cellular processes, so again, our cells do similar things to a bacterium. And of course, the universal chemical structure of DNA. So if you were to look at, I don't know, a very small chunk of our DNA versus a very small chunk of a banana DNA or bacteria, whatever, it will look identical because it's the same molecule. We'll talk about that later too. Anyway, so the explanation for all this is evolution. And evolution is the process of change that transforms life from the earliest forms to the vast array of organisms living today. I'm going to show you a picture next that shows an evolutionary tree, a very basic one. Each species represents a twig on that tree, and we have evidence that can be used to generate an evolutionary tree. Species that are very similar share a common ancestor, blah, blah, blah. You're going to learn all about this in chapter 13, and it's all pretty similar, right? So if I were to show you this, you could see that these 2 turtles are more related to each other than they are to snakes. And they're also more related to snakes than they are to humans or mammals, right? You can see just by looking at that what's what. So for chapter 13, when we get there, when we talk about evolution, you would need to be able to decipher this. So I might say to you, what's more closely related? Crocodiles and turtles or crocodiles and snakes, right? And you could look here that crocodiles and turtles have a common ancestor closer than crocodiles and snakes. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. So any questions about this slide? And then, this is just a picture talking about, again, the things we just finished, which is all these different functions, these themes of biology and how they go together. I'm not going to test you on that either. That is the end of chapter 1. So when we get back on Monday, we will start chapter 2. So over the weekend, please read chapter 2. We have time. If anybody wants to take a picture in red, come on up here. And if anybody wants to take the picture, you get extra points for that. All right, I'll do it. Whoever did it the first time, send me an email if you didn't already to remind me that you took the first picture.
I have a question. You said there were these study guides. Will those be posted?
They're already up there. Great question. So if you look under each chapter, you'll see the study guides, and also I'll share it. There you go. That's
I'm gonna email you or you already remember?
Yeah, email me just in case. I'll probably remember, but I like to have a good paper trail. Thank you.
I was wondering if you could show me how to turn them in.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's basically going to be the same as how you do labs. In that, you go to My Drive. Actually, you could do this. Once you're logged into your account, I don't know how familiar you are with Google. These little dots right here. Google Apps, you just want to go to Docs. Open up a new one. And just make sure you share it with me.
Okay, do I do like a bunch of different documents for the different,
Good question. Yes, for each paper, a different document. Yeah.
and then just label it like independent work 1 or something?
If you want, independent work 1, or you can name it after what you wrote about whatever it is you want. And if you forget that, shouldn't know, it's pretty simple. But if you look here, that really long announcement I put somewhere on here is a video. I posted a video that shows you just what I just showed you. So if you forget, it's up there.
Okay.
All right,
All right, thank you.
you're welcome. Have a good weekend.
You too.